Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. That's 1 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Now the days of Solomon drew nigh that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be thou strong therefore, and show thyself a man. And keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, and his commandments, and his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whatsoever thou turnest thyself, that the Lord may continue his word which he spake concerning me, saying, If thy children take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, there shall not fail thee, saith he, a man on the throne of Israel.
Certainly good to see you here this morning. If you don't have one of the outlines, raise your hand. One of those men in the back will get one to you. While that's being done, let me wish to all of the men Happy Father's Day, and to all of the wives, thank you for helping. It's often been said that behind every good man is an amazing woman. And I think that's true whenever it comes to fathers. You know, we are to be helpmeets, that is, suitable parts, corresponding parts. And I know that in my home that whatever father I am, the goodness of it, I owe so much to my wife. But it is something that we ought to appreciate, the opportunity to celebrate, to do those things that God demands. We do it every single day of our lives according to God's will. In Ephesians, the 6th chapter, we're to give honor unto the father and mother. And so it's good to have a day that's set aside. Whenever you look at this text, you think about the fact that David, of course, lived long before any such celebration was there. But David was a man who was a man after God's own heart. And I believe that we can learn some things from him, especially at this time, whenever he was facing death itself. And some of the things that he spoke of to his son that can help us realize what a father ought to give their children. You know, I've always been asked to get close to every Father's Day, and they say, what do you want for Father's Day? And I say, I don't want anything. You know, just be like you are, be good Christians. But the fact is, Father's Day is a time for all of us to reminisce about what we've given to our children, what type of father I am, and what I can do to make that better. But also we notice that there are things in here that a children's gift to their father, what you can give, not monetary, but something that's much more precious than that. And then also there's a great motivation for us to be the father and the children that we ought to be. So looking at this, let's just take a little time to look at the text again in 2 Kings. 1 Kings 2, verse 1 through 4. My mind went someplace else for a moment there. But in 1 Kings 2, you find that David speaks to his son. And in this, we find a description of who he was and what he desired to give unto this child. Now, we know that a father ought to desire to give unto his children the things that are good. In the book of Luke, the 11th chapter, on down through chapter 13, you find that God describes a father and relating to how a father would desire those proper things for his children. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, that if the father does not provide for his own house, he's worse than an infidel. Now, we relate that a lot of times to the physical things, but of course, if what's more important is the spiritual things, what kind of person am I if as a father I can't look at myself and see what I have provided spiritually to my children? And thus what I can be and what I can give to my children and help to mold them is to be a person who is spiritually minded. Notice in verse 1 and 2, it says, the days of David drew nigh that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son. And so now he's standing before him, and he's not giving him some physical instruction, but he's giving him things that deal with his relationship with God. That is the mind that David had. Remember, we mentioned a moment ago, as noted in the book of Acts, that David was a man after God's own heart. That's what children ought to see in us as fathers. That our primary concern is the things of God. You notice on down, he says, I go the way all of the earth, be strong therefore, show thyself a man. Did you ever think about that? How many fathers look, say, you got to be a man. And talk about, men don't cry. Men can do this. Men are able to do this. That isn't David nor God's connotation of what makes a man. He says, show thyself a man, keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, his testimonies, as it's written in the law of Moses, that thou may prosper in all that you do. So there he looks, and his father wanted him to know, and I'm sure that throughout his life is the same way. And so I look at myself and I say, is that what my children see? Do they see that, yes, I want to help them physically? I want to provide the things that I can. I want to prepare them for the things in the physical world. But what better way than to set them forth as being able to look at me as one who says, you can do things God's way. I can be the example. And that's what I've told you all along in your life. That you ought to be a person who follows God, who is willing to, as Jesus himself said in Matthew 6, to put God first. David had many struggles and trials, and some of them he lost but went back to the Lord. The devil has that temptation that is put before us, the enticement of the world. And we need to be examples that we not only want, but we live for our children. Here's our desire. Whenever we teach our children to make decisions right and wrong, what's the basis? Because I said so? Well, that in itself is a basis. You're to obey your children, or, obey your parents. I almost did it again. A lot of times kids go out and say, I love that sermon, because I say, parents, obey your children in the Lord. That's not what it says. It's, maybe I did. My mind's going anywhere and everywhere. But anyway, we ought to have children who are obedient unto their parents, but give them a basis for it in the Lord. That is, the things according to his will. My children deserve to see me as one who is able and capable in the physical realm to accomplish certain things. But they also have the right to see the basis of that is God's relationship with me, that I am a spiritually minded individual, that I make decisions not based on just what is going to be physically best for me, but what is going to be spiritually best. And in order to do that, I need to set forth the fact that I have an assurance of this relationship with God, that I know that it will work. In verse 4, he says there that the Lord may continue his word which he spake concerning me. You see, he trusted God. He assured that he had the assurance that God was able to accomplish that in his life that he had in fact promised. And so there, the relationship with God, God said it, I'm going to do it, and I know that it will work. God doesn't have a plan B. God doesn't give me something and say, well, try this, and if it doesn't work in today's society, go do something else. God's plan is it. And I need to have the confidence that the Lord has given me a word which I can continue, that I can pass down. And so there's a confidence in this relationship with God that I have, that I'm exhibiting to my children. That God's way is the way. And I'm not fearful whenever I go through. What's the worst thing that can happen? Well, I can lose my life, is what some people think. But the fact is, I don't fear death because God has given me the ability that I don't have to worry about it. David didn't look to him in verse 1 and say, you know, the days are coming that I'm going to die, and he wept and he cried and he moaned, said, I don't want to die, I don't know what's going to happen, I don't know how this is going to work out. He was assured. He knew what his fate was. He died in confidence, like the Apostle Paul. 2 Timothy 1 in verse 12, he says, I know whom I believed, and I'm persuaded he's able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. So what type of life did he have then when he faced death, when he stood at death's door? He said, I'm ready. Ready to be offered. Time my departure is at hand. Oh, how can you say that? David, how can you say that? Paul said there was a crown of righteousness that awaited, that the Lord himself would give him. Paul was no doubt a student of David. David had that same confidence, assurance as he went through life, that he didn't fear that, wasn't fearful of death, but rather he was an example of how to face life with a confidence in God's way and ultimately face death. I'm ready to die because I've done that which God has said. I've loved him and kept his commandments. And then being assured of the faithfulness of God. You know, that's part. I can't have a relationship with God unless I have this confidence that he is able. Noted that in 2 Timothy 1, didn't we? He is able to keep that. David spoke there, and he said in verse 3 and 4, he said that keep the charge of the Lord thy God to walk in his ways, his commandments, his judgments, his testimonies, that thou mayest prosper in all you do, that the Lord may continue his word which he spoke in me. In other words, God is going to do it. He had the confidence in God, the faithfulness of God, that he would do what he said. You know, this world is filled with so many choices that go before us in which we rely upon the dictates of man. And sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. You ever had anybody break their promise to you? You ever had anybody overload what they thought they could do? Sure, it happens in this world, doesn't it? But David had this assurance of the faithfulness of God that he would continue. He was able. And thus he wasn't afraid to step out and do the things that God had said. To be the type of person that he should be. And even when he failed, to go to God and know that he would be cleansed. That God would forgive just as he had promised. But then you also find that he was concerned with his children's future. He was one who was satisfied that whatever his children did to the glory of God was good and acceptable. You know, you look in verse 3. He says there, keep the charge of the Lord to walk, keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, his testimony, that thou mayest prosper. He was able to tell Solomon, we're able to tell our children. I know you're going to face a lot of difficult choices in life. You're going to be tempted in a lot of ways. But I'm here to tell you, I've shown you, but I'm here to tell you now, if you do it God's way, you're going to be better for it. The world's going to be better for it. Your family's going to be better for it. Every single individual will be blessed by your decision if you choose God. That's what he was telling me. I mean, that's the type of father that I want to be. Do you ever think about, in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, Paul said, be ye followers of me as I also am of Christ. You know, that song that we sang, the first song, Hilltops of Glory. You know, you think about that, hilltops of glory I now shall see. Oh, brother, won't you come go with me? You realize David was in essence saying that. Now, that of course relates to an earlier event where Moses saw the glory, but here that song as you think about David, and David was telling his child, I'm going to die, but I'm not afraid. I trust God. I've had this relationship. I know that everything will ultimately be good as I am with Him. Can we look at our children and in essence say, hilltops of glory I now shall see? I want you, brother. Won't you, my child, come go with me? What a glory that would be. You know, I know I'm going to die. You're going to die. I know my children recognize that. They don't like to talk about it. But the fact is, if I live to be the type of father I should be, that if I give them what I should, then my death is just another incentive. Because Pop, Dad, Padre, whatever they call me, he lived this way. And you know, we saw that it's right. He taught us it's right. One of these days, like that song, when we all get to heaven, what a glory that will be, that we can be joined together. And as we look at that, we realize that as we face the struggles of life, you know what David taught his children in this? Didn't teach them that living as a follower of God is just easy, no struggles, no trials. But that you can do it. You can overcome. You can be one that is able to live forth that life and be an overcomer. I want my children to know, and they know it well, that I'm not a perfect man. I've made many a mistake in my life. But I want them to know that God, number one, forgives. But number two, He enables us, gives us the motivation, the ability to face whatever struggle and trial there may be. That as I teach my children that living a Christian life is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Matthew the 7th chapter, verse 13 and 14, it's going to be a narrow way, but it leads to eternal life. It's going to be a way that you're going to suffer persecution, 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12, but as you realize God as a creator, as Paul speaks of, you can suffer for His sake. It's a choice I make, and I want my children to see that. So on Father's Day, I look and I think about it many times, but on Father's Day, I woke up this morning and I began thinking about the idea of Father's Day, and I thought about what kind of father am I? What kind of father have I been? What kind of father will I be? When it comes to a gift, I'm more concerned with what I give to them, because I want to give them the assurance, the confidence, the ability to know who God is and what His way is. But then you look and you think about, well, what is it that fathers do desire? Well, fathers desire a lot of things, but what could be an appropriate gift to a man such as David, such as us, if we're that type of person? You look and you find that David asked for the greatest gift that any man could desire, and that is that his children live a godly, purposeful life. That they be strong. Show yourself a man, not a man in the world's sense, but a man, a child of God, male or female. This is something that you keep the charge of the Lord thy God. John would say, I have no greater joy than to hear that thy children walk in truth. What's your greatest joy? Whenever you see your children, you know, we're blessed. I didn't get to meet the visitors on the back row, but there's a young man sitting back there with a baseball uniform on. His dad with him. Sure, he's an amazing ball player. What about your children? What do? Academics, artists, sports. And you encourage them. You say, that's great. But what's your greatest joy? You know, I look, my grandson, The rest of the kids are gone. But he's here today, and I walked up and I thought, you know what? A blessing to have my grandson lead singing. But I look, how many of our young folk are we blessed in that way? Do your children know that your greatest joy is to see them as they keep the charge of the Lord? You know, congratulate them on their worldly accomplishments, whether it be in sports, academics, or wherever it is. But whenever they do the things that are right, that ought to just make us feel so amazing. That's the greatest gift. Whenever you see the young folk who follow that example that was given and choose God, because they have so many choices. And you see them as they show forth that life, that thou may prosper in all that thou doest. You see, and their life demonstrates, which hopefully I've demonstrated to my children, that they demonstrate too. You know, living this Christian life is good. It's hard, but it's an amazing life. It is good. It is prosperous that I do, and I do it well to the glory of God. Whether I eat, drink, whatsoever I do all to the glory of God. And that the focus that they have is something beyond this world. You know, I mentioned it before, you know, one of the things that brings great joy, you know, here's a young man been playing ball or going to play ball, but he's at worship. I was at a game the other night, and I heard one of the parents, they talked, and they said, well, our game tomorrow is such and such a time. And another parent said, well, we won't be here, church. Another parent said, oh, okay, yeah, I know. I mean, it's understood. That's the life they live. And you didn't see the children whine. You don't see them complain. Why do we have to go to church? We worship God. We do what He says. We live that daily. And if something gets in the way of that, I choose God. You see, young folk need to be taught that that's the focus that they have. And they need to see it. Do you notice in verse 4 that the Lord may continue His word which He spake concerning me? If your children do this. Did you ever tie that to Ephesians, the 6th chapter? Bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. They may live long. I mean, you know, this is it. This isn't anything that's new to us. This is what we do. It's who we are. And we look, we see our children, and we see this focus in them. Why? Because they've seen it in us. We've passed it on. It's in them. They pass it on. It's in the next generation. You see the antithesis of that. Judges, the 2nd chapter, in verse 10. There arose another generation and knew not God. What happened? Maybe somebody forgot to pass it on. I don't know all that went on there. But I do know there's a generation fell away. I want to be the type of father, encourage, train the type of children who won't allow that to happen. But that there will be a generation that knows God because they've seen it in me. They've been taught about it in their life. They've seen what it was. I want to be part of a family in which they have that motivation. This life here isn't all there is. David said, I go the way of all the earth. You know, Paul talked about in 1 Timothy 6 that we came into this world naked. We're going out naked. You know, I didn't have any money when I came in, and money ain't going to mean nothing when I go out. I didn't have any awards when I came in, and they're not going with me when I go out. The judgment scene says we face death, and we'll stand before Him and hopefully hear the words, well done, thou good and faithful. The world puts a lot of things in there, but He says servant. Who we want to be. We want to be, train our children to be, servants of God. And if that's the case, every single day that you can look and say, that's what I'm doing, That's an amazing Father's Day, isn't it? That is a day that brings joy. And the great thing is, gives hope for the generation to come. I'm blessed with 6 grandkids. Sometime in the future, I hope to live long enough to see my great-grandkids. And it'll be a joy if this pattern is followed. But it's a choice that we instill within them. They make their choice, but we have the ability to give them motivation. You know, children are a heritage. It is a blessing to have the children. And we make the choice what we're going to do with them. You know, one of the things I've seen parents get so upset about things. You know, the kids may break this or do this, grandkids will break this or do that, and they get all upset. But it doesn't bother them whenever the ways of the world are brought in. We need to realize that we have and should have the ability to make proper decisions and proper focus. That we bring our children up, that we're that example, and that we point to that heavenly home that yet waits. You know, David, he made decisions in his life. Paul, though he wasn't a father, he made decisions in his life. I made decisions in my life. One of the most important decisions, or perhaps the most important decision that I made, was whenever I, on that evening, walked forward and let it be known that I wanted to be a child of God. And I rendered obedience just as was started by Jesus himself, setting forth that way of salvation. Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. That pattern is shown in the day of Pentecost in Acts the 2nd chapter. Those individuals cried out and said, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" They realized they were in sin. They repented of their sins. They, by their statements and desires, confessed Christ before others. And they were baptized for the remission of sins. And then they did like every one of us should do. Continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. Live that life. And you see through the record the generations to come. But sadly, some fell off. I made a decision, you made a decision, hopefully to be that child of God, and you made a decision to pass it on. If you haven't, what better time than today to be that type of person, mother, father, brother, sister, it doesn't matter. To be that type of person you ought